What if I told you that inside your home, there is something operating like a full-scale narcissistic system, one that rewards your child, your teenager, your young adult, your partner, your spouse, just enough to keep them psychologically hooked while demanding more of their time, more of their attention, and steadily pulling them away from real life, real relationships, and their own sense of purpose? Because that is exactly how narcissism works. A narcissistic system does not give consistent, healthy connection. It gives intermittent reinforcement, which means just enough reward, just enough success, just enough validation to keep the person coming back while never actually fulfilling them. And over time, that system begins to dominate their focus, reshape their priorities, and erode their ability to engage in anything outside of it. And this is where we need to get very honest, because video gaming is not neutral in the way we have been told. And if your child or your partner is neurodivergent, meaning their brain already has differences in dopamine regulation and executive functioning, this dynamic doesn't just exist, it accelerates. So today, we're not talking about screen time. We're talking about a system that can quietly take over attention, motivation, relationships, and in many cases, years of a person's life without anyone fully realizing what's happening. And just like a narcissistic relationship, it becomes all-consuming over time. It does not remain a neutral activity that exists alongside a full, balanced life. Instead, it begins to organize the person's internal world around it, shaping not just how they spend their time, but how they feel, how they think, and how they engage with everything outside of it. It begins to dictate mood in a very real, neurobiological way. Mood is not just an emotional experience, it is heavily influenced by dopamine availability, which is the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, anticipation, and the ability to experience pleasure. When someone is repeatedly exposed to high-intensity dopamine spikes through gaming, the brain adapts by reducing its baseline sensitivity, a process known as downregulation. This means that outside of the game, everyday life begins to feel flat, understimulating, and harder to engage with. So what you start to see is not just preference for gaming, but a dependence on it to feel okay. It dictates motivation. Motivation is not a personality trait. It is a neurochemical process. It is driven by the brain's ability to anticipate reward and initiate effort toward a goal. But when the brain becomes accustomed to immediate, effortless reward, as it does in gaming, it begins to resist activities that require delayed gratification, such as schoolwork, job searching, physical activity, or even basic daily responsibilities. This is what we refer to as a motivational impairment, where the individual is not unwilling but neurologically less able to initiate and sustain effort in lower stimulation environments. It dictates attention. Attention is governed by what we call salience, meaning what the brain deems most important or rewarding in any given moment. Gaming artificially elevates its own salience by offering constant novelty, rapid feedback, and continuous stimulation. Over time, the brain begins to prioritize this input over everything else. Conversations feel slower, tasks feel boring, relationships require more effort than the brain is now wired to tolerate. And so attention is repeatedly pulled back toward the game, not because the individual is choosing it in a fully conscious way, but because their brain has been conditioned to see it as the most rewarding option available. It dictates relationships, because as this system strengthens, it begins to compete directly with human connection. Relationships require presence, patience, emotional reciprocity, and the ability to tolerate moments that are not immediately rewarding. But when the brain is conditioned for constant stimulation, these moments can feel frustrating or even aversive. What you begin to see is withdrawal, not always dramatic, but gradual. Less eye contact, shorter conversations, increased irritability when interrupted, a reduced desire to participate in family activities or social interactions, This is not simply defiance. It is what we call relational disengagement, where the individual is pulling away from connection in favor of a system that requires less and gives faster. And perhaps most importantly, it dictates regulation. Emotional regulation refers to the brain's ability to manage and respond to emotional experiences in a flexible and adaptive way. But when a person is using gaming as their primary form of regulation, which is often the case in neurodivergent individuals, their brain becomes externally dependent on that system to stabilize mood. This is what we call maladaptive coping, where the strategy being used provides short-term relief but undermines long-term functioning. So when the game is removed, the brain does not simply return to baseline, it experiences a form of dysregulation. Irritability increases, frustration, tolerance decreases. Emotional responses become more intense and harder to manage. And this is where the comparison to narcissism becomes even more relevant. Because a narcissistic system does not just take your time, it restructures your priorities, your emotional responses, and your sense of what feels good, what feels worth it, and what feels possible. It becomes the central organizing force in your life. And that is exactly what gaming can become. Not because the individual is weak, not because the parent has failed, but because the system itself is designed to pull them in, keep them there, and make everything outside of it feel less compelling. And over time, what begins as a form of entertainment can quietly become something much more powerful. A system that shapes behavior, limits growth, and, if left unexamined, can slowly take over the trajectory of a person's life. Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. I'm Stephanie Buckley, parenting strategist and family systems coach, and I specialize in helping families understand what's actually happening underneath the behavior, whether that's ADHD, executive functioning challenges, emotional regulation, or the patterns that keep families stuck. I'm also a mom to a now thriving, multifaceted musician, singer, songwriter, 23-year-old neurodivergent son with ADHD. I've been with my husband for over 3 decades, and everything I share here comes from both professional experience and lived experience, because I know what it feels like to be in it, not just study it. This podcast was created to give you real tools, real strategies, and a deeper understanding of the brain and the family system, so you're not just reacting in the moment, but leading your home with clarity, structure, and confidence. Because here's the truth. Most of what we're dealing with as parents today is not just behavioral, it's neurological, it's environmental, and it's systemic. And when we don't understand the system, we end up personalizing what is actually predictable. So in today's episode, we're going to break down something that is showing up in more and more homes, especially neurodivergent homes, and that is the role of video gaming. But not from the surface level. We're going to look at what gaming is actually doing to the brain, how it impacts dopamine, motivation, emotional regulation, and why it can quietly begin to take over, not just your child's time, but their development, their relationships, and their ability to engage with real life. And I'm going to walk you through this in a way that helps you see it clearly, so you can stop guessing, stop second-guessing yourself, and start approaching this with strategy. Today, we are not talking about gaming as entertainment. We are talking about gaming as a neurobiological and behavioral system that, when left unstructured, can take hold of the brain in a way that competes with daily life. And I am going to say this clearly. In neurodivergent homes, video games can function like the ultimate narcissist pulling attention, rewarding immediate gratification, eroding relationships, and reshaping how the brain engages with effort, responsibility, and connection. To understand why this happens, we have to start with dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, reward, anticipation, and goal-directed behavior. Dopamine is not simply about feeling good, it is about the brain's ability to initiate action and sustain effort toward a goal. I am going to repeat this in hopes that it sinks in In neurodivergent individuals, particularly those with ADHD, there is what we call dopamine dysregulation, meaning that baseline dopamine levels are lower and less stable. This creates a constant internal state where the brain is seeking stimulation in order to feel engaged, focused, or even normal. Now layer in video games. Video games are designed to produce rapid, repeated dopamine spikes through what is known as a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, which is one of the most powerful behavioral conditioning systems in psychology. Rewards are delivered unpredictably, which keeps the brain in a constant state of anticipation. This strengthens neural pathways associated with the activity, making it increasingly difficult to disengage. Over time, the brain becomes conditioned to expect high intensity, immediate reward, and begins to devalue activities that require effort, patience, and planning. We then have to look at executive functioning, which refers to a set of cognitive processes managed by the prefrontal cortex, including planning, organization, impulse control, task initiation, and follow-through. Task initiation is the ability to start a task without excessive delay, and follow-through is the ability to sustain effort until completion. In neurodivergent brains, these processes are already less efficient. When gaming becomes the dominant source of dopamine, it further weakens the brain's ability to engage in low-stimulation tasks. What I see across homes is not just a lot of gaming. I see a breakdown in execution, a young child who struggles to transition from play to basic routines like brushing teeth or getting dressed, because the brain is already conditioned to seek higher levels of stimulation. A teenager who understands exactly what needs to be done, homework, responsibilities, commitments, but cannot initiate the task without significant prompting, and even then, struggles to follow through. A young adult who talks about wanting independence, wanting a job, wanting to move forward, but remains stuck in a cycle of avoidance because the effort required feels neurologically overwhelming. And this is where parents often misinterpret what they are seeing. They see lack of effort. I see a dopamine-driven initiation deficit. Now we need to talk about emotional regulation, which is the ability to manage and respond to emotional experiences in a flexible and adaptive way. Emotional regulation relies heavily on the interaction between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, which is the part of the brain responsible for processing threat and triggering emotional responses. When the brain is regulated, the prefrontal cortex helps modulate emotional reactions. When the brain is dysregulated due to fatigue, stress, or dopamine depletion, the amygdala becomes more dominant. This leads to what we call an amygdala hijack, where emotional responses override logical thinking. Gaming intensifies this cycle. After prolonged gaming, the brain often enters a dopamine depletion state where baseline dopamine levels drop. This creates irritability, low frustration tolerance, and heightened emotional reactivity. So what I see in homes is not just excessive gaming, but difficulty regulating emotions outside of the game. A young child may have disproportionate reactions when asked to stop playing or transition to another activity. A teenager may respond with irritability, defensiveness, or shutdown when faced with expectations. A young adult may become overwhelmed by relatively minor stressors because their nervous system is not equipped to handle low-stimulation environments without dysregulation. In adult relationships, this shows up as a partner or spouse who appears emotionally unavailable, easily frustrated, or disengaged, especially when pulled away from gaming or asked to participate in responsibilities or connection. When I describe gaming as a narcissistic system, I am referring to a pattern that is characterized by control of attention, prioritization of immediate gratification, erosion of relationships, and resistance to boundaries. I see it dictate how much time is spent with others, how present someone is in a conversation, and how willing they are to engage in anything that does not provide immediate reward. I see individuals become mentally preoccupied, where even when they are not actively gaming, their thoughts are anchored to it, anticipating it, planning for it, or waiting to return to it. This is what we call cognitive occupation, where mental bandwidth is consumed by a single reinforcing activity. In young children, this can look like decreased interest in outdoor play, imaginative play, or face-to-face interaction. The child who once engaged with the environment begins to prefer the predictability and stimulation of the screen. In teenagers, this often looks like withdrawal from social interaction, reduced participation in family life, and a growing resistance to responsibilities. The teen may still desire connection, but the effort required feels greater than the reward. In young adults, this dynamic becomes more concerning. I see individuals delaying entry into the workforce, avoiding responsibilities, and struggling to build independence not because they lack intelligence or potential, but because their brain has been conditioned to operate in an environment that does not require sustained effort. And in adult relationships, I see partners who are physically present but emotionally absent. Conversations are limited, engagement is minimal. There is a sense that the relationship is competing with something that consistently wins. What makes this particularly important is that development is not just about age, it is about experience. Skills like emotional regulation, frustration tolerance, social interaction, and independence are built through repeated real-world engagement. When gaming becomes the dominant activity, those experiences are reduced. Outdoor play, which supports physical development and sensory regulation, decreases. Face-to-face interaction, which builds social skills and emotional awareness, decreases. Effort-based tasks, which build resilience and confidence, decrease. Over time, this creates what we can think of as a developmental gap, where chronological age continues to increase, but experiential growth does not keep pace. And this is where we begin to see the long-term impact not as a sudden shift, but as a gradual divergence between potential and lived experience. Traditional approaches often focus on limiting screen time or increasing consequences. But if we are not addressing the underlying neurobiology, those strategies will only go so far, because this is not simply a behavioral issue. This is a system involving dopamine regulation, executive functioning, emotional regulation, and reinforcement patterns. Because this is not simply a behavioral issue. What we are looking at is a multi-layered neurobiological and psychological system that is shaping how the brain initiates, responds, and engages with the world. When families try to address this only through limiting screen time or increasing consequences, they are addressing the surface, but not the system underneath that is driving the behavior. When I talk about dopamine regulation, I am referring to the brain's ability to produce, release, and maintain stable levels of dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, anticipation, and goal-directed behavior. Dopamine is what allows someone to not only want to do something, but to start doing it and stay engaged long enough to complete it. In neurodivergent individuals, particularly those with ADHD, dopamine regulation is often impaired, meaning the brain operates with a lower and less stable baseline. What this looks like in real life is that activities that require effort like homework, chores, job applications, or even basic routines feel disproportionately difficult to initiate. When video games enter the picture, delivering rapid and repeated dopamine spikes, the brain begins to recalibrate its expectations. Now, everyday tasks feel even more understimulating by comparison. Over time, this creates a pattern where the individual increasingly gravitates toward high dopamine activities and avoids those that require sustained effort, not because they lack desire, but because their brain is operating from a place of dopamine dependency on high stimulation. Layered on top of this is executive functioning, which refers to a set of cognitive processes governed by the prefrontal cortex that allow an individual to plan, organize, initiate tasks, regulate impulses, and follow through. Executive functioning is not about intelligence, it is about execution. when executive functioning is compromised, you see a breakdown between knowing and doing. An individual may fully understand what needs to happen. They can explain it, agree with it, and even feel motivated in a moment of clarity. But when it comes time to act, there is a failure to initiate or sustain the behavior. In practice, this might look like a teenager who verbally commits to completing an assignment but never starts it, or a young adult who talks about applying for jobs but avoids opening the application. The introduction of high dopamine activities like gaming further weakens these systems because the brain becomes conditioned to expect immediate reward, making effort-based tasks feel neurologically overwhelming. This is what we call an initiation deficit, where starting becomes the primary barrier, and a follow-through impairment, where even started tasks are abandoned before completion. We also have to look at emotional regulation, which is the ability to manage and respond to emotional experiences in a flexible and adaptive way. Emotional regulation depends on the balance between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for processing threat and triggering emotional responses. When dopamine is stable and the nervous system is regulated, the prefrontal cortex helps modulate emotional reactions, allowing for patience, flexibility, and problem solving. However, when dopamine drops, as it often does after prolonged gaming, the brain becomes more vulnerable to dysregulation. This creates a state where frustration tolerance is low, irritability is high, and emotional responses become more intense and less controlled. What this looks like in everyday life is a child who has a disproportionate reaction when asked to stop playing, a teenager who becomes defensive or shuts down when given feedback, or a partner who responds with irritability when asked to engage in something outside of gaming. This is not simply a behavioral reaction. It is a state-dependent emotional response where the brain is operating from a dysregulated baseline and seeking the fastest path back to equilibrium. Finally, we have reinforcement patterns, which refer to the way behaviors are strengthened over time through reward. In behavioral psychology, reinforcement is what increases the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated. Video games are built on one of the most powerful reinforcement systems, known as a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, where rewards are delivered unpredictably but frequently enough to maintain engagement. This keeps the brain in a constant state of anticipation, driving repeated behavior. Over time, this creates deeply ingrained behavioral loops, where the brain learns that gaming is the most reliable way to experience reward, success, and relief. In contrast, real-life activities such as school, work, or relationships offer slower, less predictable rewards, making them less appealing to a brain that has been conditioned to expect immediacy. What this looks like over time is a gradual shift in behavior where the individual increasingly prioritizes gaming over other activities, not out of conscious choice, but because the reinforcement system has been recalibrated. When you step back and look at these four components together, dopamine regulation, executive functioning, emotional regulation, and reinforcement patterns, you begin to see why this is not something that can be addressed through simple behavioral strategies alone. This is a closed-loop system where each component reinforces the other. Dysregulated dopamine impacts executive functioning. Impaired executive functioning increases avoidance. Avoidance leads to more gaming. Gaming reinforces the dopamine cycle, and emotional dysregulation makes it even harder to interrupt the pattern. This is why families feel stuck, because they are trying to change a behavior, when what they are actually dealing with is a system. And once you understand that, the approach shifts from control and frustration to strategy and structure, grounded in how the brain actually works. And without addressing those layers, we are asking the brain to operate in a way that it is not currently equipped to do. Teehee question shifts from, why won't they just stop? To, what is the brain relying on? And how do we restructure the environment to support real-life engagement? Because in neurodivergent homes, this is not about removing something your child enjoys. This is about recognizing when something has become the primary regulator, the primary motivator, and the primary competitor to real life. And when that happens, the goal is not control. The goal is rebalancing the system so that relationships, responsibilities, and real-world experiences can begin to hold value again. This episode is for educational purposes and to provide support. It's not a substitute for professional mental health evaluation, diagnosis, or treatment. The more we learn to recognize the neurological and behavioral patterns behind what we are seeing, the more effective and compassionate we can be in how we respond. Let me give you another example, because this is something that can be incredibly confusing for parents, especially when it looks like things are working during the week. There is a pattern that shows up in many neurodivergent homes where gaming is restricted during the week and then allowed often freely on the weekends. On the surface, this seems balanced and even responsible. During the week, the child or young adult is attending school, participating in sports, completing responsibilities, and appearing relatively regulated. But what is often missed is what is happening at the level of dopamine cycling and neurochemical depletion across the week. When gaming is introduced in large quantities over the weekend, what you are often seeing is a form of dopamine binging, which closely mirrors what we understand in psychology as a binge reward cycle. This is not about substances, but the mechanism is strikingly similar. The brain is exposed to repeated, high-intensity dopamine spikes through gaming fast rewards, constant stimulation, immediate feedback. During this period, the brain becomes highly stimulated, but also begins to downregulate its natural dopamine production, a process known as dopamine desensitization, where the brain reduces its sensitivity to maintain equilibrium. Then the game turns off. And what follows is not neutral. What follows is a dopamine crash, a sharp decline in available dopamine levels, leaving the brain in a state of relative depletion. This is where we see what's called a motivational deficit state, where initiating effort-based tasks becomes significantly harder. So now, as the week begins, the child or young adult is not starting from baseline. They are starting from a neurochemical deficit. This is why Monday mornings can feel disproportionately difficult. It is not laziness. It is not defiance. It is a brain that is under-resourced in the very neurotransmitter required for activation, engagement, and follow-through. As the week progresses, something interesting begins to happen. Because gaming is restricted, the brain is forced to seek dopamine through more adaptive, effort-based pathways, physical activity, social interaction, accomplishment, routine. This is what we call dopamine recovery through natural reinforcement systems, where the brain slowly begins to recalibrate. By the middle of the week, you may notice improved mood, increased productivity, and a greater willingness to engage. The individual may appear more motivated, more present, and more emotionally regulated. And then the weekend comes again, and the cycle resets. This creates what we would describe as a dopamine oscillation pattern, where the brain is repeatedly moving between states of overstimulation and depletion, never quite stabilizing. Over time, this inconsistency can impair the development of baseline regulation, which is the brain's ability to maintain steady emotional and motivational functioning across environments and days. From a family systems perspective, this is where confusion sets in. Parents begin to question their instincts. They see their child functioning well during parts of the week and assume the system is working, not realizing that what they are observing is a temporary recovery phase, not stability. This can lead to intermittent reinforcement confusion, where inconsistent outcomes make it harder to identify the true driver of behavior. And in neurodivergent individuals, where dopamine regulation and executive functioning are already more vulnerable, this cycle becomes even more pronounced. The brain becomes increasingly reliant on high stimulation input to feel normal, while everyday life begins to feel harder to engage with. This is why the pattern can feel so disorienting, because it doesn't present as a constant problem. It presents as a cycle, and cycles are much harder to recognize until you know exactly what you're looking for. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this episode was helpful, I'd love it if you shared it with a fellow parent, caregiver, or educator who might need it too. You can also subscribe to stay up to date on future episodes and check out additional tools and resources at thepaththopeacetherapy.com. Follow me on Instagram at thepaththopeacetherapy. If you are in California, I offer virtual sessions if you are not in the Hermosa Beach and South Bay area. You can book online at The Path to Peace Therapy. And as always, take a deep breath, give yourself some grace, and remember, peace is possible, and you don't have to do this alone.